The blizzard had come out of nowhere that December afternoon in 1883, and Beatrice Brennan stumbled through the knee-deep snow with frozen tears crystallizing on her cheeks, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly. Her husband had screamed those final words before shoving her out the door without even her coat, his face twisted with rage and disgust, convinced the child she carried belonged to another man despite her desperate pleas of innocence. The accusations were lies, poison whispered by his bitter sister who had never wanted them married. But Jacob Brennan had believed every venomous word, and now Beatrice was alone in the Wyoming wilderness, with night falling fast, and the temperature dropping so low that each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass into her lungs. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though it could have been mere minutes in her confused state, her thin house dress soaked through and clinging to her body like a frozen second skin. The baby moved weakly inside her, and she pressed her hand more firmly against her stomach, trying to will warmth into the small life that depended entirely on her survival. Her feet had gone numb somewhere back near the edge of town, and now she could barely feel the ground beneath her as she pushed forward through the white hell that surrounded her on all sides. The wind howled like a living thing, whipping snow into her face and stealing what little heat remained in her body, and Beatrice knew with terrible certainty that she was going to die out here in this frozen wasteland. Her legs gave out suddenly, and she collapsed face first into a snowdrift, the impact jarring but painless through her numbness. She tried to push herself up, but her arms refused to obey, and she lay there gasping, feeling the cold seeping deeper into her bones with every passing second. The baby kicked once, twice, then went still, and Beatrice sobbed into the snow, grief and fear overwhelming even the physical agony of freezing to death. She thought of her mother back in Pennsylvania, wondered if anyone would even find her body come spring, whether Jacob would feel any remorse when they discovered her frozen corpse with their innocent child still inside her. The world began to fade around the edges, darkness creeping in despite the white brilliance of the snow, and Beatrice felt herself slipping away into that final cold embrace. She stopped fighting, let her eyes drift closed, and prepared for whatever came after this life. At least she would not have to endure Jacob's hatred anymore, would not have to see the disgust in his eyes when he looked at her, would not have to bear the weight of false accusations that had destroyed everything she held dear. Quinton Westwood had been tracking the elk for 3 days, and he was not about to let a blizzard steal his prize after coming so close to a clean shot. The 26-year-old rancher had grown up in these Wyoming mountains, knew every canyon and ridge like the back of his rope-worn hands, and he had weathered worse storms than this one. His horse, a sturdy paint mare named Ginger, picked her way carefully through the deepening drifts while Quinton scanned the white landscape for any sign of shelter. He had a camp set up in a small cave about 2 miles east, and he figured he could make it there before full dark if he pushed hard. That was when he saw the dark shape half buried in the snow about 30 yards off his path. At first, he thought it might be a deer or coyote that had succumbed to the cold, but something made him rein Ginger toward it, some instinct that told him this was not just another animal casualty. As he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest when he realized it was a woman, her dark hair spread across the white snow like spilled ink, her body already dusted with a fresh layer of powder. Quinton was off his horse before conscious thought, dropping to his knees beside her and brushing snow from her face with shaking hands. She was beautiful even in her frozen state, her features delicate and fine-boned, her lips already turning blue. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat and felt the faintest flutter of a pulse, so weak he almost missed it. She was alive, barely, and without immediate intervention she would be dead within minutes. He scooped her into his arms, shocked by how light she felt, and that was when he noticed the swell of her belly beneath the thin, soaked dress. She was pregnant, heavily so by the look of it, and rage flooded through him at whoever had left her out here to die in such a vulnerable condition. He secured her on Ginger's back, wrapping his own heavy coat around her frozen body, then swung up behind her and kicked the mare into a gallop despite the treacherous conditions. The cave was too far, he realized with growing desperation. She would be dead long before they reached it, so he needed to find shelter now and get a fire going immediately. His eyes caught on a rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile ahead, and he urged Ginger toward it, praying there would be enough overhang to provide protection from the wind. They reached it just as full darkness fell, and Quinton nearly wept with relief when he discovered a shallow depression in the rock face, deep enough to shield them from the worst of the storm. He slid off the horse and carefully lifted the woman down, carrying her to the driest spot he could find and laying her gently on the ground. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he gathered deadwood from beneath the overhang, wood that had remained relatively dry thanks to the rock shelter above. He had flint and steel in his saddlebag, and within minutes he had coaxed a small flame to life, feeding it carefully until it grew into a proper fire that pushed back the deadly cold. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman, stripping off her frozen dress with clinical detachment, knowing modesty was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. Her skin was white as the snow outside, her lips that terrible blue color, and Quinton wrapped her in both his spare blanket and his coat before pulling her close to the fire. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, wincing at how cold her flesh felt beneath his calloused palms. The baby, he kept thinking, what about the baby? But he had no way of knowing if the child still lived without the mother waking to tell him. He held her against his chest, sharing his body heat, one arm wrapped protectively around her while he kept the fire fed with his free hand. Hours passed in that liminal space between night and morning, the storm raging outside their small shelter while Quinton fought to keep both the fire and the woman alive. He talked to her, told her she had to fight, had to come back, that he had not ridden through a blizzard and used up half his winter firewood supply just to have her give up on him now. As dawn began to break, painting the storm-gray sky with streaks of pale gold, Beatrice's eyelids fluttered open. She stared up at the rocky ceiling above her, confusion clouding her blue eyes, then turned her head to find a stranger's face inches from her own. She tried to pull away, but her body refused to cooperate, every muscle stiff and aching. "Easy now," the man said, his voice rough from hours of talking to her unconscious form. "You are safe. I found you in the snow last night, brought you here." Memory came flooding back, and Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her belly. She felt the swell there, felt the baby move beneath her palm, and tears of relief streamed down her face. "The baby," she whispered, her voice cracked and raw. "Is the baby alive?" "I do not know," Quinton admitted, his dark eyes filled with concern. "But I felt movement a few minutes ago, so I think so." "How far along are you?" 7 months, Beatrice said, and then she was sobbing in earnest, great heaving cries that shook her entire body. Quinton held her through it, this broken stranger who had literally been thrown away, and felt something shift in his chest, some wall he had built around his heart after his parents died 3 years ago beginning to crack. When her tears finally subsided, Beatrice pulled back slightly and met his eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life, both our lives." "What happened?" Quinton asked gently. "How did you end up out there in just a dress in the middle of a blizzard?" The story came spilling out of her, all the pain and betrayal and fear, and Quinton's jaw clenched tighter with every word. By the time she finished, explaining how her husband had believed his sister's lies and cast her out, he was struggling to control the fury that burned in his gut. What kind of man threw his pregnant wife out into a storm, regardless of what he believed she had done? He is wrong, Beatrice said fiercely, meeting Quinton's eyes. I never betrayed him. The baby is his, but he would not listen, would not believe me. I believe you, Quinton said, and he meant it. There was something in her eyes, a core of honesty and strength that told him she was incapable of the kind of deception her husband had accused her of. And even if you had, which I know you did not, no one deserves what he did to you. They stayed in the shelter through the morning as the storm gradually blew itself out, and Quinton shared his rations with Beatrice, making her eat slowly despite her hunger. She needed to regain her strength, and he watched her carefully for any signs of frostbite or other lasting damage from her ordeal. Her fingers and toes were red and painful, but nothing looked blackened, which was a good sign. As the day wore on and they talked, Quinton found himself drawn to this woman in ways he could not fully explain. She was intelligent and articulate, with a wry sense of humor that surfaced despite everything she had been through. She asked him about his life, and he found himself telling her about his ranch, a modest spread about 15 miles south of where they sat, and how he had been working it alone since his parents succumbed to influenza the previous winter. It is hard work for one person, he admitted, but it is mine, and that means something. It means everything, Beatrice agreed, understanding lighting her eyes. I always wanted something that was truly mine, something no one could take away. By mid-afternoon, the storm had passed, and pale sunlight broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape into a glittering wonderland. Quinton helped Beatrice onto Ginger, his coat still wrapped around her for warmth over the spare shirt and pants he had given her from his pack. They rode slowly through the deep snow, Quinton walking alongside to spare the horse the extra weight, and he found himself glancing up at Beatrice every few minutes, checking to make sure she was all right. She caught him looking once and smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face, and Quinton felt his heart skip in a way it had not in years. He was in trouble, he realized, serious trouble, because he was already halfway in love with this woman he had known for less than 24 hours. They reached his ranch as the sun was setting, painting the snow orange and gold, and Quinton lifted Beatrice down from the horse with gentle hands. The ranch house was small but well built, a 2-room cabin his father had constructed with help from neighbors back in the early 70s. It was not much, but it was warm and dry, and Quinton felt a surge of pride as he carried Beatrice over the threshold and set her carefully on his bed. I will sleep on the floor, he said quickly, seeing her eyes widen. You need the bed for you and the baby. Over the following days, they fell into an easy routine. Quinton tended to his animals and kept the cabin warm while Beatrice rested and slowly regained her strength. They talked for hours each evening, learning each other's stories, and Quinton found himself marveling at how right it felt to have her there. How the cabin felt like a home again, instead of just a place to sleep between long days of work. Beatrice felt it too, this growing connection between them, and it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was still technically married, even if her husband had tried to kill her through abandonment, and she had no idea how to proceed. But every time Quinton smiled at her, every time his hand brushed hers as he passed her a cup of tea, she felt her heart leap in a way it never had with Jacob. A week after he found her, Quinton rode into the nearest town, a small settlement called Elkhorn about 20 miles northeast, to gather supplies and information. He returned with news that made Beatrice go pale. Jacob Brennan had left town 3 days after the blizzard, heading back east without a word to anyone about his missing wife. As far as anyone in Elkhorn knew, Beatrice had simply disappeared during the storm, and most assumed she had perished. "He did not even look for me," Beatrice whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. "He just left." "Then he is a fool and a coward," Quinton said fiercely, kneeling in front of her chair and taking her hands in his. "Any man who would walk away from you deserves nothing but contempt." Their eyes met and held, and something electric passed between them. Quinton reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his palm. "I know we have not known each other long," he said softly, "but I need you to know that you and your baby are welcome here for as long as you want to stay. Forever, if you choose." "Quinton," Beatrice breathed, her eyes filling with tears. "I am married. I have nothing to offer you but trouble and another man's child." "You are married to a man who tried to kill you," Quinton countered. "And any judge in Wyoming would grant you a divorce based on abandonment and attempted murder. As for the baby, any child of yours is a child I would be proud to raise as my own." The kiss, when it came, was soft and sweet and filled with a tenderness that took Beatrice's breath away. She had never been kissed like this, like she was something precious and fragile, like she mattered beyond her usefulness as a wife and potential mother. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "I am falling in love with you," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know it is too soon, I know it is foolish, but it is true." "Then we are both fools," Quinton said with a grin that lit up his entire face, "because I have been in love with you since you opened your eyes in that cave, and the first thing you did was worry about your baby." Winter deepened around them, and they existed in a bubble of growing intimacy and affection. Quinton was careful to be respectful, sleeping on the floor despite Beatrice's protests, but they spent every waking moment together. He taught her about ranching, and she proved to be a quick study, helping with what chores she could manage in her pregnant state. She cooked meals that made him groan with pleasure, real home cooking that he had not tasted since his mother passed, and she mended his clothes with neat, careful stitches. They talked about the future carefully, neither wanting to presume too much. Beatrice would need to formally divorce Jacob, which would require tracking him down or getting a lawyer to file papers based on abandonment. It would take time and money they did not have much of, but Quinton was determined to do things properly. "I want to marry you right," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. "No question of impropriety, no shadow hanging over us. You deserve that." "I do not care about propriety," Beatrice said softly. "I care about you. But I understand, and I appreciate that you want to do things properly." February arrived with more snow and bitter cold, and Beatrice's belly grew larger with each passing week. Quinton found himself fascinated by the changes in her body, the way the baby moved and kicked, and Beatrice would laugh and guide his hand to feel the child's movements. Those moments were intensely intimate, and Quinton felt his love for both mother and unborn child growing deeper every day. They were snowed in for 2 weeks in mid-February, and during that time, Quinton taught Beatrice to shoot, figuring she should know how to protect herself if anything ever happened to him. She proved to be a natural, her hand steady and her eye keen, and Quinton felt a fierce pride watching her master the skill. One night, as the wind howled outside and they sat close to the fire, Beatrice suddenly gasped and pressed her hand to her belly. "The baby," she said, her voice tight with pain. "Something is wrong." Quinton was at her side instantly, his heart hammering with fear. "What is it? What do you feel?" "Pain," Beatrice panted, her face pale. Sharp pains like cramping. It is too early, Quinton. I am only 8 months along. He helped her to the bed and covered her with blankets, his mind racing. The nearest doctor was in Elkhorn, 20 miles away through impassable snow, and even if he could make it there and back, it would take days. He would have to deliver the baby himself if it came to that, and the thought terrified him more than facing down a grizzly bear. But the pains subsided after an hour and Beatrice's breathing eased. "False labor," she said weakly, relief evident in her voice. "My mother told me about it." The body practicing for the real thing. Quinton sat beside her all night anyway, holding her hand and watching over her, and when dawn broke gray and cold, he was still there, his vigil unbroken. Beatrice woke to find him asleep in the chair beside the bed, his hand still clasping hers, and her heart swelled with love for this good, steady man who had entered her life like a miracle. March came, and with it the first hints of spring. The snow began to melt, revealing brown grass and muddy earth, and Quinton prepared to ride to Elkhorn to find a lawyer and begin the divorce proceedings. Before he left, he kissed Beatrice thoroughly and made her promise to stay inside and not overexert herself. "I will be back in 3 days at most," he told her, his hands framing her face. "If anything happens, if you need help, fire 3 shots and the neighbors will come. The Johnsons are about 5 miles east and they are good people." "I will be fine," Beatrice assured him, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "Just come back to me." "Always," Quinton promised, and then he was gone, riding toward town with legal papers and hope in his saddlebag. He returned 2 days later with a lawyer's promise that divorce papers would be filed within the week, citing abandonment and cruelty. The lawyer had been sympathetic when Quinton explained the situation, and had agreed to expedite the process as much as possible. Wyoming law required a waiting period, but given the circumstances, the lawyer thought they could have everything finalized within 6 months. Beatrice wept when he told her, relief and joy mixing together, and Quinton held her close. "6 months," he murmured into her hair. "And then you will be free, and I can make you my wife properly." "I already feel like your wife," Beatrice said softly. "My heart belongs to you, Quinton. The papers are just a formality." The baby came on a warm April afternoon, 3 weeks after Quinton's trip to Elkhorn. Beatrice was hanging laundry when her water broke, and she barely made it inside before the contractions started in earnest. Quinton, who had been working in the barn, heard her call his name and ran, arriving to find her doubled over by the table. The next hours were the longest of Quinton's life. He had helped birth calves and foals, but this was entirely different. This was Beatrice in pain, and he felt helpless and terrified. But he pushed through his fear, boiled water and gathered clean linens like the midwife book he had purchased in Elkhorn instructed, and he stayed by Beatrice's side, letting her grip his hand hard enough to leave bruises. "You can do this," he told her over and over, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You are the strongest person I know. You survived a blizzard and a husband's betrayal. You can do this." And she did. As the sun set, painting the cabin walls gold and orange, a baby's cry filled the air, thin and reedy but strong. Quinton carefully cleaned the infant, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes, and wrapped the baby in soft blankets before placing the child in Beatrice's arms. "A boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You have a son." Beatrice gazed down at her baby with tears streaming down her face, love radiating from every pore. The child had dark hair like hers and blue eyes that would likely change color in the coming weeks. He was beautiful and perfect, and she could not imagine how Jacob had thrown this away, had thrown them both away. "Thomas," she said softly. "I want to name him Thomas after my father. Thomas Westwood, Quinton said, testing the name. "It has a good sound." Beatrice looked up at him sharply. "Quinton, we cannot. You are not legally his father, and I am still married to Jacob. It would not be proper." "Then we will use your maiden name for now," Quinton said, though his eyes were sad. "But Beatrice, I meant what I said. This child is mine in every way that matters. I will love him and raise him as my own, and when the divorce is final and we are married, I will legally adopt him if you allow it." "I allow it," Beatrice whispered. "I want nothing more than for Thomas to be your son in truth." The weeks after Thomas's birth were exhausting but joyful. Quinton proved to be a natural father, taking to the role with enthusiasm and tenderness. He would walk the floor with Thomas when the baby fussed at night, singing off key lullabies that somehow always worked. He changed nappies without complaint and watched over both mother and child with fierce protectiveness. Beatrice recovered slowly, her body healing from the trauma of birth, and she marveled daily at the life she had somehow found herself living. 6 months ago, she had been married to a man who barely tolerated her, and now she was living with someone who loved her so completely it took her breath away. She watched Quinton with Thomas, saw the love in his eyes when he looked at her son, and knew she had found something rare and precious. Summer arrived, warm and green, and news came from Elkhorn in late July. The divorce had been granted, the judge ruling in Beatrice's favor based on abandonment and cruelty. Jacob had not even contested it, had signed the papers when they were delivered to him in Philadelphia and sent them back without a single word. Beatrice was free. Quinton proposed that same evening, dropping to one knee in the cabin doorway with the sunset behind him and Thomas sleeping peacefully in the cradle Quinton had built with his own hands. "Beatrice Brennan," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise to love you and Thomas with everything I have for all the days of my life." "Yes," Beatrice said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in Elkhorn 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the small church with the Johnson family as witnesses. Beatrice wore a dress the Johnsons' daughter had helped her sew from fabric Quinton purchased in town, pale blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Quinton wore his best suit, somewhat threadbare but clean and pressed, and he could not stop smiling as he slipped a simple gold band on Beatrice's finger. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Quinton kissed his bride, he poured all his love and devotion into it. Beatrice kissed him back with equal fervor, joy radiating through her entire body. She was Beatrice Westwood now, married to a good man who loved her, and her son would grow up knowing he was wanted and cherished. The wedding celebration was small but heartfelt, and they returned to the ranch as the stars came out, Thomas sleeping peacefully in Beatrice's arms. That night, for the first time, they shared the bed as husband and wife, and Quinton made love to his bride with a tenderness and passion that left them both trembling and breathless. "I love you," Beatrice whispered in the darkness afterward, her head on Quinton's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I did not think I could feel this way about anyone, but you proved me wrong." "I love you too," Quinton said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You and Thomas are my whole world. I would do anything for you." The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under their joint efforts, and they added a small herd of cattle to go with the horses Quinton had been breeding. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child, and he worshipped his father, following Quinton around the ranch from the moment he could walk. Quinton formally adopted Thomas when the boy was 2, and they celebrated with a special dinner and a cake Beatrice baked. When Thomas was 3, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again, and Quinton's joy knew no bounds. This child, he knew, was his by blood as well as love, though he never loved Thomas any less. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in the spring of 1888, Beatrice gave birth to another son, a strapping baby they named Samuel after Quinton's father. 2 years later came a daughter, and Beatrice wept with happiness as she held little Margaret in her arms. The girl had Quinton's dark eyes and Beatrice's delicate features, and both her parents and brothers were instantly smitten. Thomas, now a protective 6-year-old, took his role as big brother seriously, always making sure baby Margaret was safe and happy. The cabin grew crowded with 3 children, so Quinton spent 2 summers building an addition, expanding the house to include 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor. Neighbors came to help with the raising, and the community that had seemed so distant when Beatrice first arrived had become like family. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, years when money was tight and they had to stretch every penny. There were illnesses and injuries, the constant worries that came with raising children and running a ranch. But through it all, Quinton and Beatrice faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinton took Beatrice on a picnic to the spot where he had found her all those years ago. The rocky outcropping looked different in summer, green and alive instead of buried in snow, but Beatrice recognized it instantly. "I think about that night sometimes," she said softly, holding Quinton's hand. "How close I came to dying, how lucky I am that you were there." "It was not luck," Quinton said firmly. "It was fate. We were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together. Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked, a question that had haunted her occasionally over the years. Taking on another man's wife and child, all the complications that came with it. Quinton pulled her close, kissing her with the same passion he had shown on their wedding day a decade earlier. "Never," he said against her lips. "You and Thomas and Samuel and Margaret are the best things that ever happened to me. I thank God every day for that blizzard because it brought me you." Beatrice laughed, tears of happiness streaming down her face, and kissed him back. They stayed there on the hillside until sunset, talking and laughing and simply being together. 2 souls who had found each other against all odds. The children grew and thrived. Thomas proved to have his mother's intelligence and his father's steady reliability, and he took to ranching with natural skill. When he was 18, Quinton signed over a portion of the land to him, allowing Thomas to start his own small ranch adjacent to the main property. Thomas married a sweet girl from Elkhorn named Catherine when he was 21, and they gave Quinton and Beatrice their first grandchild a year later. Samuel was wilder than his older brother, with a love of adventure that kept his parents alternating between pride and terror. He became a skilled horse trainer, with a gift for working with even the most difficult animals. At 19, he signed on with a cattle drive to Montana, promising to return in 6 months. He kept his word, coming home with money in his pocket and stories that made the whole family laugh until they cried. Margaret was the scholar of the family, teaching herself to read by age 4 and devouring every book she could get her hands on. Beatrice taught her everything she knew, and when Margaret was 16, she took a position as the schoolteacher in Elkhorn. She was fierce and independent, refusing several marriage proposals before finally accepting one from a young lawyer named Daniel Hart when she was 22. They settled in Elkhorn, close enough that Margaret could visit often. Quinton and Beatrice grew older together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming weathered and worn from years of hard work. But their love never dimmed. They still held hands while walking, still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, still talked for hours each evening about everything and nothing. On a warm summer evening in 1910, 27 years after that fateful blizzard, Quinton and Beatrice sat on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children and grandchildren had gathered for a family celebration, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from inside the house. "We did good," Quinton said softly, his arm around Beatrice's shoulders. "Look at what we built. This family, this life." "We did," Beatrice agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Sometimes I still cannot believe how lucky I am. That terrible night in the snow led me to you, to this beautiful life." "Not luck," Quinton repeated as he had so many times over the years. "Fate. You were always meant to be mine, and I was always meant to find you." Thomas emerged from the house, now a grown man of 27 with children of his own, and joined his parents on the porch. "Everything all right out here?" he asked, his voice warm with affection. "Perfect," Beatrice said, reaching out to squeeze her eldest son's hand. "Everything is absolutely perfect." Thomas smiled, the same smile that had lit up his face as a baby, and returned inside to rejoin his family. Quinton and Beatrice sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky, grateful for every moment, every challenge, every joy that had brought them to this perfect evening. They had started in desperation and despair, in frozen snow and certain death, but they had built something beautiful together. A family, a home, a love that would endure for generations. And as Quinton pulled Beatrice closer and pressed a kiss to her temple, both of them knew with absolute certainty that they had found what so many spend their whole lives searching for. They had found home in each other, and nothing in this world or the next could ever change that. The blizzard that had nearly killed Beatrice had instead led her to life, real life, filled with love and purpose and belonging. And every single day, she thanked whatever divine providence had put Quinton in her path that frozen December night. The porch door opened again, and Samuel appeared, his wild energy barely contained even at 25. "Come on, you two," he called. "Margaret is about to serve dessert, and she made your favorite, Ma, apple pie." Beatrice laughed and let Quinton help her to her feet. Her body was older now, less resilient than it had been, but she was happy down to her bones. They walked inside together, hand in hand as always, to join their family in celebration. The house was full of noise and love, grandchildren running underfoot while the adults talked and laughed. Margaret presided over the dessert table with the same fierce competence she brought to everything, making sure everyone got a generous slice of pie. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting protectively on her back, and Quinton felt a surge of gratitude that all his children had found good partners, people who loved them as completely as he loved Beatrice. Later that night, after everyone had gone home or retired to their rooms, Quinton and Beatrice prepared for bed in the room they had shared for 27 years. The bed was the same one Quinton had given up to Beatrice that first week, the one where Thomas had been born and where they had conceived Samuel and Margaret. It held so many memories, so much love and life. "What are you thinking about?" Beatrice asked, seeing the distant look in Quinton's eyes as he unbuttoned his shirt. "That day I found you," Quinton said honestly. "How different my life would have been if I had ridden a different path, if I had been even a few minutes later. I would have lived my whole life without knowing you, without Thomas and Samuel and Margaret. It is a terrible thing to contemplate. But it did not happen that way," Beatrice said, crossing to him and placing her hands on his chest. "You found me. You saved me. You loved me when I had nothing to offer but trouble and heartache, and we built this beautiful life together." "I would do it all again," Quinton said, covering her hands with his. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every worry. I would live through all of it again just to have this, to have you." They kissed, a kiss filled with decades of love and devotion. And then they climbed into bed together as they had thousands of times before. Quinton pulled Beatrice close, her back to his chest, his arm around her waist, and they fell asleep to the sounds of their family settling in for the night around them. Years continued to pass, and Quinton and Beatrice remained devoted to each other through all of life's changes. They celebrated 50th birthdays and then 60th, watched their grandchildren grow and start families of their own. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, with Samuel and even Margaret contributing when they could. When Quinton's joints began to ache with arthritis and Beatrice's eyesight started to fail, they helped each other through it, just as they had helped each other through everything else. Thomas and his family moved into the main house to help care for them, and Quinton and Beatrice found new joy in being surrounded constantly by the family they had created. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1928, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. There were children and grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren now, dozens of people whose lives existed because Quinton had found Beatrice in that blizzard 45 years earlier. The house overflowed with love and laughter, and Quinton and Beatrice sat in places of honor, marveling at the legacy they had built. "I love you," Beatrice whispered to Quinton as they watched their family celebrate around them. "I have loved you from the moment I opened my eyes in that cave and saw you watching over me. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Quinton replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my heart, my home, my everything." The best decision I ever made was riding toward that dark shape in the snow instead of away from it. They kissed, surrounded by their family, and everyone cheered and applauded. Thomas, now a silver-haired man of 45, raised his glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "who taught us all what real love looks like, who showed us that family is not just about blood, but about choice and commitment and showing up every single day. We are all here because of your love, and we are grateful beyond measure." To Quinton and Beatrice, the family chorused, raising their glasses, and the couple smiled at each other through happy tears. As the sun set that evening and the party wound down, Quinton and Beatrice took their customary walk around the property, moving slowly now but still hand in hand. They visited the barn where Quinton had first brought Beatrice all those years ago, now expanded and modernized. They walked past the addition Quinton had built when the children were young, and the newer structures Thomas had added over the years. "We did good," Beatrice said, echoing Quinton's words from years earlier. "Better than good. We built something that will last." "Because we built it on love," Quinton said simply. "Love that was tested and proven, love that survived everything life threw at us." They stood together watching the stars come out, just as they had on countless evenings throughout their marriage, and both felt a deep sense of peace and completion. Whatever time they had left, whether it was years or months or days, they would spend it together, just as they had spent every day since that frozen night in December 1883. The blizzard had tried to take Beatrice's life, but instead it had given her everything worth living for. And Quinton, who had set out to hunt elk that day, had found something far more precious than any game animal. He had found his soulmate, his partner, the other half of his heart. As they walked slowly back to the house, where their family waited with warmth and love, both Quinton and Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that their story was the kind that would be told for generations. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Because it showed that love could bloom in the darkest circumstances, that kindness could change everything, that two broken people could come together and build something whole and beautiful. And when they finally settled into bed that night, surrounded by the sounds of their family in the rooms around them, they fell asleep with smiles on their faces and their hands clasped together, just as they had been for 40 years and would remain until the very end of their days.